So, the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack. An upgrade to the service that most people only have so they can play Nintendo games online at like 50% speed. Sorry, I'm being unfair. Sometimes it's 70. More importantly, what does this expansion give us? Well, for the low annual price of over double the original subscription's value, you can get Animal Crossing's $25 DLC, which will go away the moment you stop paying for the subscription, and official emulators that play worse than their free unofficial alternatives. Aggressive intro, I know. But it's kinda hard to pretend there's value in this at the moment. When this video goes up, it'll only have been around a couple of months since the expansion pack released, so it's more than likely just an at-the-moment kind of issue. At some point, the benefits will add up, and the subscription will be worth it. It's a tactic that a lot of companies are fond of from time to time, Nintendo included. Until then, however, we should absolutely make fun of it until they fix it, because seriously, what is this? You're not here for my random opinions though. You're here for information. And the information people have been sharing about these emulators is very interesting. Mostly the Nintendo 64 collection, mostly bad things. Many are going as far as to say it's the worst emulator Nintendo has produced yet, citing things like atrocious input lag, missing features, and severe graphical issues. You may have seen the screenshots of the Dark Link room. That's supposed to be water. These are valid complaints, but claiming these to be the worst they've ever done is quite a statement. Whether it's true or not all of the evidence people use to support this claim makes sense. Issues like European games running at their original reduced speed of 50 Hz, or Mario Kart 64 not allowing ghost data, I mean, those suck, but I can't think of an official Nintendo emulator that didn't have those issues. And, unfortunately, even when you bring up issues like atrocious latency, there are strong contenders for that category. So why don't we take a deep dive and test that stance? This is the perfect excuse to take a look back at all the emulators Nintendo made, from the well-loved Wii Virtual Console, to the random secrets and extras found in various Nintendo games. Admittedly, there's going to be a focus on the N64 thanks to my intrigue-induced bias, but I'll make sure I don't overlook the other emulators as well. Nonetheless, I think the information we'll find here is interesting enough to warrant the teardown. Welcome to Tech Rules. But first, a huge thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring today's video. Self-improvement is not exactly the easiest thing in the world, and picking up new skills couldn't be farther from an exception. Like many things in life, it's a commitment. A commitment to your time, a commitment to hunting down the learning resources you need, and a commitment to stick to your goals. That's why Skillshare exists. They provide an ad-free online learning community with thousands of great classes, allowing you to hone your skills, pick up brand new ones, or just explore an astounding amount of topics and creative outlets you wouldn't even have thought about otherwise. On top of this, Skillshare utilizes video lessons, class projects, and hands-on feedback to maximize your learning, with bite-sized lessons that can fit in just about any busy schedule. Trust me, I know a thing or two about busy schedules. There are quite a few things I never would have tried out if it weren't for Skillshare having an easy-to-digest course on it. Here's a great example, actually. Modern CSS, Writing Better, Cleaner, More Scalable Code by Harry Roberts. As many programmers learned the hard way, writing something the quick and easy way now doesn't mean you saved yourself some time for later. In fact, it probably means more time and frustration further down the line when you can't build on whatever nonsense you originally made. CSS in particular can be a nightmare for this. And this course is a great resource for those who want to avoid putting themselves in that corner. Interested? Try it now! The first 1,000 people to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. As you can see, Skillshare can help you make 2022 a year of new learning, growth, and connection through creativity. So act fast and start exploring your creativity today. Anyway, on to the video. Before we can talk about the emulators themselves, it's probably important to distinguish what is and isn't an emulator. Probably sounds pointless to some of you, right? An emulator is just a piece of software that imitates another device. Okay, well, let me mention the Super Game Boy, the device that let you play Game Boy games on the Super Nintendo. Is that an emulator? I mean, considering how I brought up the question, the answer is obviously no, but here's why. The Super Game Boy takes advantage of something called virtualization. The most taxing part of emulation is the actual conversion and interpretation of code. The SNES's architecture, which means the way it handles code from a hardware perspective, is entirely different than that of a Game Boy. Despite the fact that the SNES is more powerful than the Game Boy, emulating it would require taking those instructions, converting them into something the SNES understands, and running said instructions, all in real time. This explains the overhead that causes slowdowns in emulation. If the instructions can't be processed as soon as we get them, then we need to slow down so we can. Virtualization, on the other hand, doesn't have this limitation. There's minimal conversion for virtualization, as the code being sent over is already something the machine understands. The only things that need to be emulated in this case are smaller and typically much less demanding demanding aspects of the system. This is why the Wii was able to play GameCube games pretty much perfectly. Same for the DS for GBA games. In these cases, the architecture of the devices is almost identical to their predecessors. They resemble more powerful versions of the old device in a way. Also explains why unofficial emulators for these devices often cover both iterations. It just makes sense to do so unless your project is hyper-focused on one of the devices in particular. It's important that I explain that now, since it's going to be a bit of a running theme down the line. For now, let's refocus on the Super Game Boy. Namely, I still haven't explained how the Super Game Boy is able to process Game Boy code natively, which, as we just established, is required for virtualization. The answer is probably simpler than you'd expect. It's just because it is a Game Boy. Literally, I think it's just missing the screen and buttons and all that. The only thing the SNES really does here is interface with the game and handle some of the extra features that the Super Game Boy provided. Even ignoring the unparalleled performance this provided, this level of virtualization essentially guaranteed that every game would run well, a level of compatibility almost impossible for emulators. This would be Nintendo's go-to for a really long time. Any emulation they would even attempt to pull off on their systems would have to be the ones that aren't very demanding, and even then they would often need to make the emulation extremely optimized for the game. Still happened though, as shown by Animal Forest on the Nintendo 64. That game had various NES games you could find and place in your house, at which point you could actually play the games. That's official NES emulation on the N64, which is pretty cool. However, Animal Forest itself plays an even bigger part to this story, because you probably know the game by its international name, Animal Crossing. It didn't get that title until it was released for the GameCube. I don't mean as the next iteration in the series either. I'm referring to an expansion to the very N64 game we were just talking about, re-released for the GameCube. This is a big deal when we're talking about N64 emulation, mainly because it's not. See, the Nintendo 64 is notoriously difficult to emulate. Explaining exactly why is not a brief or easy task, but it primarily has to do with the sheer complexity of how the N64's CPU calculates graphics. Emulating that aspect accurately is a feat so difficult that emulators instead opted to make quick approximations that worked about as well, and then didn't move away from it for a really long time. Because of this, compatibility across the N64's library was notoriously iffy, with massive graphical glitches and accuracy errors in even the most well-known titles. It's really only just started to get better within the past few years, if we're being honest. In other words, emulation was an unrealistic solution for this Animal Crossing release. And obviously, virtualization wasn't feasible for a single game release either. With both of these solutions being out of the question, Nintendo opted for the secret third option. Take the game's source code and straight up port Animal Crossing to the GameCube. Porting takes a tremendous amount of time and resources to do, so the fact they went for this option should show you how much trouble it would have been to emulate the game. Granted, it's not like they didn't take shortcuts. A lot of ways the game handles data are still being emulated just because it was easier than rewriting them, similar to how virtualization still emulates small things here and there. However, it's not enough emulation to categorize this game as anything other than a port. And because it's now essentially a GameCube game made with N64 level performance in mind, it runs amazingly. So amazingly, in fact, that the entire game famously fit on the GameCube's 24MB memory. Once it copied the game over, it didn't even bother to check the disk unless it needed to perform memory card functions or switch over to the NES emulator. So yeah, feel free to straight up take the disk out while you're playing the game. It'll continue working just fine. As far as the GameCube itself is concerned, it had its fair share of emulation. Like I said, the NES emulators from Animal Crossing made a return, which is funny because if Animal Crossing had been emulated, you would have been emulating an emulation of an NES game. That actually made my brain reset for a second. Additionally, a reverse engineering enthusiast named James Chambers discovered a few years back that there were going to be even more games you could play later by loading them to your memory card. There's also the Pokemon box you can get from the Real Life Pokemon Center that had emulations of Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, provided you can connect your GBA and prove that you own the game. Metroid Prime let you play the original NES game, and on the virtualization side of things, the Super Game Boy sees its spiritual return with the Game Boy Player, which plays Game Boy Advance games on the GameCube through the same method of basically being a GBA. Notably, the Game Boy Player does have certain oddities to it. For one, the game seems to assassinate a pianist if you fail to set it up properly. Not startling at all. But on a more serious note, it suffers from some compatibility issues, which is weird, considering it's an extremely involved degree of virtualization. There shouldn't really be big problems like that at all. Well, turns out it's not that big of a mystery because the limitations were an intentional design choice. The games that aren't compatible with Game Boy Player are primarily from the Game Boy Advance video series. Well, they're not really games, anyway, just collections of movies and TV shows that could be watched on your GBA and existent quality. The supposed compatibility issue just comes from the software checking to see if it's running on a Game Boy Player, and refusing to function if it did. If you modded the ROM or used a cheat device to bypass it, it runs flawlessly. It was obviously an anti-piracy measure, as well as a way to encourage actual DVD sales, but you were worried about us watching this on our TVs? There were also physical limitations, of course. Stuff like WarioWare Twisted technically being incompatible because it involved tilting the entire Game Boy, and doing so with your GameCube isn't really feasible. But, stop me. Regardless, the point I'm making is that when Nintendo does go for emulation, it's for systems that are easier to emulate. And even then, they're meant for use with very specific games they've optimized it for. Seeing as they had to set these limitations for the lighter stuff, it's not hard to imagine why they weren't able to emulate N64 games on the GameCube. Anyway, disregard literally everything I just said because they did it anyway. If you had pre-ordered The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, you were given a bonus disc that featured Ocarina of Time and a ROM hack of the game inspired by the cancelled expansion Ura Zelda, or as us overseas fans know it as, Ocarina of Time Master Quest. Now, despite everything I just said, this game is pretty much 100% emulated and runs nearly perfectly. Like, the stuff I went over is still true. The GameCube doesn't really have the resources to perfectly run an N64 game like this, at least not without making massive compromises and accepting that some things aren't gonna work. But sometimes something comes around with so much clever coding and optimization that it makes something work that really shouldn't work. Admittedly though, that's the power of knowing exactly what hardware you're working with. The team that put together this emulator understood the architecture of the GameCube very well, and because of that they were able to take advantage of every quirk and optimization they could get their hands on, resulting in a genuinely great way to play Ocarina of Time. In some ways it's an improvement over the original game. Things like running at a higher resolution, loading faster, and generally performing better in laggy areas. Naturally, because of the issue we talked about earlier, accuracy isn't anywhere near perfect. However, there's nothing in here that should make any notable difference in gameplay. That being said, it's not witchcraft and it does have its limitations. Limitations that were pushed front and center with The Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition. This is a collection of Zelda games from the past, ironically not to the past, but whatever, in a 20-minute demo of Wind Waker. Naturally, all these old games are emulated. The NES games are handled using an evolved form of the emulator seen in Animal Crossing. And the N64 games use the emulator we just saw running Ocarina of Time. Here it continues to emulate Ocarina of Time, but also adds Majora's Mask to its collection. Majora's Mask, notably, was one of the 3 games in the N64 library to require something called an expansion pack, a device that increased the system's 4MB memory into 8MB. It's also one of the 2 that actually used it in a meaningful way. Sorry DK64, but when your requirement of the expansion pack is so baffling that people mistakenly believe the devs forced people to buy it just so they didn't have to fix a bug, you may not have been using it in a meaningful way. Point is, a demanding game like Majora's Mask should really push the limits of the emulator, and unfortunately it did. Hard. Playing Majora's Mask on the Collector's Edition was nowhere near ideal. Unlike Ocarina of Time, this version of Majora's Mask actually performed worse than what the original N64 version did. And worst of all, it introduced a crashing issue. Crashing is a really bad issue to have for Majora's Mask, as the game only saves when you restart the 3-day cycle. No matter how cautious you are, there's nothing you can do to protect yourself from a random crash happening at the end of a cycle and losing a lot of progress. It's rough to go from the great experience of OOT to this. But I wouldn't be talking about this emulator so much if this were the end of its story. The emulator would, as far as I know, not appear again on the GameCube. However, it would eventually become the basis for the Wii's N64 Virtual Console titles. The Wii Virtual Console is when Nintendo started leaning really hard in emulation, releasing old games for all kinds of platforms. These emulators are pretty good, mostly consisting of old platforms that aren't too hard to emulate, and they do a perfectly fine job of imitating the original experience. However, their library does feature games from the Nintendo 64, something much more advanced than the rest of the lineup. And that same OOT emulator returns here and exceeds expectations once again. Like I mentioned before, the architecture of the Wii was extremely similar to the GameCube's, meaning the hyper-specific optimizations found in the GameCube version could still be repurposed for the Wii, now able to take advantage of the huge increase in power. This was further improved by making specialized versions of the emulator for each game in the library. What resulted was, to many people, the definitive way to play most of these games. I don't think I have to explain that this is high praise coming from retro game enthusiasts. Even today, if you were to ask them what the best way to play an N64 game was, and that game was featured on Wii VC, the answer you'll get is probably Wii VC. Even speedrunners, justifiably the most picky players when it comes to emulation, think highly of the N64 Wii VC. Due to the improved performance and loading times the emulator usually provides, it typically has an advantage over its original N64 counterparts, and input latency is basically non-existent. Input latency here, simply put, only refers to how quickly the game responds to controller inputs compared to the N64 counterparts. Responsiveness is extremely important in speedrunning, considering they're no stranger to frame-perfect tricks. Despite that, most speedrunners claim that they don't feel a difference in the way Wii VC controls. The emulator isn't without its flaws, of course. It doesn't emulate a controller pack, meaning stuff like Mario Kart Ghost data is inaccessible, and each game has its own share of emulation quirks and inaccuracies. But again, mostly not perceptible to the average player. Something the emulator did do wrong though is the analog stick. The GameCube stick has a different range than N64 games, so the emulator had to approximate. It works, but it's less than ideal. Lightly pressing the stick in a direction is interpreted as much deeper than you'd expect, making slight movement a lot less precise. This doesn't affect normal gameplay too much, thankfully, but if you've ever played one of the Zelda 64 games on Wii and thought, wow, the aiming is a lot worse than I remember it being, you'd be right. Despite the fact that it's not a deal breaker, this issue is relevant because someone going by the name of Electromodder straight up made a device that intercepts your controller as it goes into the Wii. The intention being to skew your analog inputs in such a way that it more closely resembles real N64 input. The end result is input being contorted so that the small adjustments, the part that matters most, is preserved as closely as possible. It supports a few games, since the inputs were different for each N64 game, but it's most well known for Ocarina of Time. There's a speedrun glitch called the Extended Super Slide, or ESS, that requires very slight stick movement to execute. Notably, this glitch was extremely unreliable to pull off on the Wii version, frustrating for such a time-saving glitch. That's why this adapter was a big deal for those speedrunners, to the point where it's most popularly known as the ESS adapter. Needless to say, most of its owners are Zelda speedrunners. For what it's worth, I do own one, and they do make the games nicer to play overall, but I definitely wouldn't have bought one if it weren't for some OOT research I was doing in the past. Of course, this is a controversial device in speedrunning, considering emulation inaccuracies are sometimes beneficial to speedruns. Stuff like OOT allowing you to do a lot of stuff that would have crashed the game originally, and if you're familiar with Super Mario 64 A-button challenge, you might be aware of the emulator's rounding error that allows you to save an A press by waiting 3 actual days for this platform to rise, something it's unsurprisingly not supposed to do. Point being, the adapter creates a weird situation where you're fixing certain emulation inaccuracies, but taking advantage of others. But to be fair, legitimacy versus speedrun accessibility and enjoyment is a common argument, and the right answer is typically up to the speedrunning communities themselves. This is a great example, as the ESS adapter ended up being allowed in Ocarina of Time speedruns, but banned in Majora's Mask speedruns, despite both greatly benefiting from the adapter. There are a lot more fun and interesting things to note about the simulator, but those are the highlights, and I have a lot more stuff to go over. Oh, actually, one last thing. Despite my best efforts, I could never find out what specific team worked on this emulator. A shame due to its quality. However, when the Switch's N64 emulator was released, Volvagia224, a software engineer and notable OOT speedrunner, did put together a brief history of Nintendo's N64 emulation that you might have seen. It's a good read in and of itself, you can find it in the description, but in it, he mentions someone named Steven as the one responsible for heading development of this emulator. This was actually what I needed to figure it out. Turns out it was the Nintendo Software Technology Corporation, and this Steven was Steven Lee, who literally put this information in his LinkedIn. I am bad at my job. Anyway, as far as other systems in this virtual console lineup, emulation was perfectly fine, and even got fixes and quality of life improvements. For example, text changes. The intro to the original Zelda resembles actual English now, typos were fixed, and a lot of text straight up had to be changed because of legal issues, from the players in Tecmo Bowl having their names wiped, to Piston Honda no longer bringing up the NHK. What's interesting is that, while most of these changes were essentially done through ROM hacking, N64 ROMs were basically untouched. This is interesting because some of the N64 games are the ones with the most changes. Ocarina of Time revised one of the Gerudo's prevalent symbols that was essentially a symbol of Islam, going against their no religion policy. Pokemon Snap also added a feature that let you send pictures to your Wii's message board. Despite the changes of these games and a bunch of others, extracting the ROMs themselves will give you something identical to the original releases. That's because the emulator patched these changes into the game in real time. This is not something that was done on the Zelda discs. Changes for that system were also applied directly to the ROM, which is why footage of the official Master Quest release always has GameCube-style buttons, even if they were extracted and played in an unofficial emulator. That means it's a new feature introduced in Virtual Console. Odd, since the other emulators have no problems with changing the ROM. Oh, and like with the Animal Crossing situation, ROM injection eventually ended up being a thing. Modders learned how to open up the channel, remove the intended ROM, and replace it with their own to make these official emulators run different games. Compatibility was pretty high on most platforms, some exceptions were the N64 emulator's low compatibility considering the tuning that had to be done for each game. Oh, and the, pseudo hard-coded games, like the entirety of the Neo Geo library for some reason. Some of the other arcade games too, I think. Gonna be honest, didn't test the whole collection, and information on this stuff is scarce. Mainly because, outside of certain platforms and mods, the injection method wasn't really useful. Open source emulators were ported to the Wii all the time, which usually worked better than the official ones. And if you were able to inject ROMs into your Virtual Console channels, you were also able to run homebrew. It mainly ended up being used for N64 ROM hacks. However, with the nice features introduced by Virtual Console, there were also issues that plagued nearly the entire collection. One of the bigger issues is the European titles, which typically ran at their original 50 Hz. That was the refresh rate of your average PAL CRT, and games released in Europe needed to run at 50 Hz to match. This is done by literally slowing the game down to match this lower refresh rate. To say this was a frustrating experience is beyond an understatement, especially if you knew how the game was supposed to play. Europe fortunately didn't have to deal with this anymore by the time the Wii was released, thanks to slowly adopting 60 Hz themselves. Nintendo must have thought it wasn't a big deal though, because most European Virtual Console releases still ran at the slower 50 Hz. I wish I could give a technical answer as to why they chose to do this, but it seems to be that they just didn't want to bother. Frustrating for sure. Another irritating decision was the inclusion of a dark filter as an anti-epilepsy measure. It's not too bad, but someone with a lot of experience playing the original titles might be a little off-put by it, especially on NES, which on top of this filter, used a weirdly dark color palette to boot. This makes the darkness on NES a lot more noticeable, unfortunately, but otherwise the filter was a passable compromise. Okay, I think that covers the Wii Virtual Console. There's a lot to talk about for Nintendo's first big attempt at emulation, but I'm sure you want to hear about the future emulators too. Unfortunately, things went a bit downhill. With the release of the Wii U and 3DS came the eventual release of their Virtual Console. The emulators of the Wii have been scrapped at this point, in favor of a new set of emulators for both of these new consoles. We'll be focusing on the Wii U, but to my understanding both systems run the same emulators. Each emulator tends to have its own issues, but common themes are noticeable input delay, steps backward in accuracy, and oh no, it's spreading. Yeah, the dark filter from the Wii has now gotten a lot worse. Don't get me wrong, addressing epilepsy concerns is much more important than one-to-one accuracy, but turning the lights off isn't something I would call a fix. There's not even an option to turn this thing off, and it never really stops being noticeable. At least the effort is disabled for certain games that don't have these concerns, and it's not present at all on the 3DS. Oh, but the 50 Hz problem is still a thing. Sorry, Europe. Admittedly though, it's not unplayable. Most of the games in this collection don't have bad enough inaccuracy issues that they make the experience worse, and input lag wasn't bad to the point of frustration. Mostly. And we finally got an overseas release for one of the Mother games. Granted, it was the first one, titled Earthbound Beginnings, and it suffers from really ugly blurring thanks to a quirk of the NES emulator, and only the NES emulator for some reason. But just having an official release of the game is still pretty cool. Gave everyone a lot of hope that they would eventually localize Mother 3. They didn't. Anyway, the N64 experience was awful. Somehow the dark filter feels even darker here, and the input lag is astonishingly bad. Bad enough that many completely avoided N64 titles on the Wii U. I could try to put into words how rough it is, but 2DOS said it all back during SGDQ 2015.
Alright, if you can kind of see the camera, I don't know if you can, but it's really that bad. It's not a joke.
It's funny actually, since the Wii U had a Wii virtualization mode, you could just play the original Virtual Console and usually have a better experience. Genuinely, despite the Wii U's technical superiority, the Wii emulator pretty much performs identically and loads almost insignificantly slower than the Wii U version. One look at OOT World Records shows that actually. If the difference in loading times were in any way significant, we would see the Wii U version up there too. But it's not nearly enough to justify playing the version that controls terribly. Unfortunately, some speedrunning communities didn't get to choose. Donkey Kong 64 is an example of this, as it was a game that was released for the Wii U's VC lineup, but not the Wii's. It was also originally a very laggy game. This lag is essentially non-existent on the Wii U's emulation of it, to the point where some parts of the game run much faster than intended, since they were designed with the lag in mind. This would normally be a harsh blow to speedrunners of the game, since the lack of lag would make this version the fastest official version of the game to exist, and not playing on it would be automatic time loss. Thankfully, DK64 is also a very glitchy game. One of the game's quirks is, when the game lags, the speed of your character is increased. That way, even when the game is massively slowing down, it still feels like you're going the same speed. Since more lag essentially equals more speed as far as the game is concerned, speedrunners can intentionally create a lot of lag and go so fast that they easily climb slopes and clip through objects. Although the Wii U runs faster, losing these glitches makes the overall run slower, so speedrunners can stick to the N64 version that, upsettingly, is still the definitive way to play the game. That is, unless you're doing a run where big skips are prohibited or otherwise irrelevant. Then you're stuck with Wii U, unless you want to lose time. Let's just play that clip again. The biggest shame here is a step backward we've taken from the Wii version. A lot of issues the Wii version went out of its way to fix is completely overlooked on the Wii U, making it feel like it was made by a completely different team. However, since Nintendo doesn't provide credits for these emulators, we couldn't confirm that for a really long time. The only thing we'd really know here is that Stephen Lee would not have been part of it, considering he had already left Nintendo by this point. Thankfully, the answer to this question was found in the Nintendo Giga Leak, where we got some source code from the 3DS version of the emulator. Turns out, these emulators were handled by iQ Studio, a company that primarily existed to handle the Chinese side of Nintendo's affairs. Notably, they made the iQ player in 2003. It was not emulation, interestingly enough. It was basically just a more powerful N64 that played a small handful of localized titles. This one actually caused a bit of a stir in the speedrun community, since it was technically an official release, and text-heavy games would be faster thanks to Chinese dialogue generally being shorter. The fact that the iQ player is an emulation doesn't really matter here, but shows why there's such a difference in quality compared to the emulation we're looking at now. While this emulator might have been passable, being compared to the Wii emulating the same games did no favors for it. I'm sure some of the code was reused here, but again, the architecture is different. Wii-specific optimizations can't just be ported to the Wii U. And it's not like this emulator didn't improve on its predecessor in some aspects. The better accuracy of titles like Star Fox 64 is a good example of that. That being said, it's painful to see such a step backward. But hey, at least they finally added save states. Side note, you may have heard rumors that on the 3DS build of this emulator, putting faulty passwords into the original NES Metroid would potentially brick the entire system until the issue was patched. As you might have guessed, that's not real. I promise you, the emulator does not have the power to do that to your system, and there's no evidence of it happening otherwise. Worst it can do is lock it up and require a hard shutdown. You are safe to engage Ridley however crudely you want. Injection's still possible here, but again, if you can do that, you can probably just run better emulators on the Wii U. However, I do want to give a shout out to one emulator in this collection that really stands out, the Wii U's DS emulator. DS emulation is also one of those things that's kinda tricky, and even on PC, it had a history of issues that plagued emulators. Despite this, the games featured in the Wii U's DS library ran great. It was even one of the few things on the system to put the gamepad to good use, allowing you to put your bottom screen there for touch controls and use your TV for the top screen. There's also nifty hybrid layouts, and compatibility for injecting other games is actually pretty high, all things considered. If you have a modded system, you can even modify the configuration options to bump up the internal resolution and get rid of that annoying dark filter. It's a great way to play DS games on your TV, honestly. It's such a contrast to the rest of the emulators here, and admittedly, that's because a different team was responsible. It was developed by Nintendo European Research and Development, or NERD. It seems they were also responsible for the super stable 3D feature in new 3DSs, and notably, the emulators we'll see going forward in the NES and SNES Classic. These emulators are fantastic, honestly. Accuracy is high, input lag isn't bad at all, there are filters and display modes for your ideal experience, the colors look great, and I can actually see how nice they are because they added an actual anti-epilepsy feature instead of a dark filter, thank you! Just, NERD really went above and beyond with these systems. It was kind of a shame, honestly, because only using them on the NES and SNES Classic was the perfect way to make their efforts wasted, in a way. The classics were devices marketed toward collectors who didn't really buy the systems for the purpose of playing them, and retro gamers who don't own new systems and want an easy way to get their nostalgia fix. Admittedly, they'll have a great experience playing the NES and SNES games on here, and that's awesome. It's just funny because it's better than they probably even notice, meaning the extra mile the developers went to is pretty much overlooked. Obviously, I'm not saying hardcore retro enthusiasts who could tell the difference didn't buy the system, but for those people, how the emulators and the devices ran didn't matter too much. The software itself is Linux-based and easily replaceable. Because of this, modding the system and replacing the emulators inside with unofficial ones was really easy. No matter how good the official emulator is, odds are it's not beating community-based passion projects that have been in the works for decades. The point I'm trying to make is, it's underrated. If you want to learn more about it, there's a fantastic video from My Life in Gaming that covers pretty much everything you'd want to know about it. I'll link it in the description. For the record, their channel is all about high quality analysis like this. I think they're worth your sub. Still, their efforts didn't end up going to waste after all, because these emulators were improved and re-released on the Switch as part of the Nintendo Switch Online service. As long as you have the base subscription, you have access to all these games, and they all run extremely well. I can pretty confidently say these are the best official emulators for both of these systems out there. Admittedly, there was an obnoxious prompt at the bottom of the screen that existed only to remind you that you have buttons, but they eventually added an option to remove it. On top of the benefits I already discussed regarding the classics, they would also throw in a special edition version of games, which were typically just save states of the games that put you in interesting situations. Oh, and there's also online play for the first time, with the SNES version having rollback. What? I don't know about you, but this was A shock to me when I discovered it. Nintendo isn't exactly known for being frontiers when it comes to online play, or for being competent at it if we're being honest. Most online games that involved a lot of interactivity among players, like fighting games, typically used a delay-based netcode. The game will only progress when both players have received the latest frame. If not, the game stalls. And boy will a peer-to-peer connection stall at large enough distances. This issue is typically lessened by adding a delay before processing inputs, but as we've seen from our previous examples, input delay in retro games is inherently frustrating. Rollback is an alternative that basically asks for forgiveness instead of permission. If a player's inputs aren't received in time, it'll move on with the most likely scenario, correcting it if it ends up being wrong. It's usually a much better implementation than the delay-based alternative, but harder to implement since it relies on being able to rewind the game, use the correct input, and instantly resume to current play. Admittedly, the emulators do have rewind functions that's been around since their classic versions, but that's only part of the issue. Online play for emulation has its own share of problems. Instead of just picking and choosing the aspects that need to be synced among players, the emulators themselves have to sync up the entire game state, since they aren't communicating with the game directly. For rollback to work, the entire game has to be resynced every time there's a hiccup, and this has to be done quickly enough to appear seamless. That's not an easy thing to pull off. In this case, I imagine it's using some rollback delay hybrid implementation, but the end result is minimal input delay regardless of the distance. And that's above and beyond the kind of online play you'd typically expect from a Nintendo title. Unfortunately, the NES emulator is still entirely delay-based. The SNES emulator came out roughly a year later, so it's not like it doesn't make sense, but it would be really nice if they could backport it to the NES emulator someday. It really does make a world of difference. Overall though, the quality of these emulators is a very good look for Nerd, immediately followed by a bad one. The Genesis emulator is great like the other two we talked about, not much to say about it, but we've taken a huge step back once again with our N64 titles. It's worth noting that the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack isn't the first time we've seen this emulator. We first saw it in Super Mario 3D All-Stars. It, of course, was responsible for running the remastered Super Mario 64. Notably, it was running the Shindo version of the game, a Japanese-only version that came out after the US release. It fixed a bunch of glitches, the backwards long jump included, made some improvements, and messed with some voices. This is the first time we've ever gotten an international release of Shindo. Like with the other N64 emulators, the ROM itself is still an unmodified version of Shindo. The localization and upscaled textures are patched in by the emulator. Nerd also made the emulator that runs the other two games in this collection, Sunshine and Galaxy. Galaxy has even been partially ported, much like the Animal Crossing example from earlier, but for a different reason. That one did it to make performance better. In Galaxy's case, it was probably for the sake of its motion and touchscreen controls. The more demanding parts of the game still seem to be emulation, and for what it's worth, it's pretty much flawless. Sunshine had some odd issues here and there, like nonsensical frame rate drops, audio bugs, and debug graphics that weren't supposed to show up, but most of these issues were eventually patched and the game runs fine. That being said, the N64 emulator is the only one we've seen after this. Whether or not the other emulators will show up again is something only Nintendo knows. As far as drawbacks, the only huge one was some noticeable input delay. The game itself was fine. Moving forward to its newest iteration, however, we have some problems. Graphical issues plague a lot of these games at the time of recording, and unfortunately, Ocarina of Time is one of the biggest offenders. Two of the biggest issues with the emulator is its excessive input lag and its poor rendering of fog. OOT in particular takes these two issues and throws them front and center. Not only does OOT use fog very heavily, but it wasn't exactly the most responsive game in the first place. Adding any more delay than that is going to be a lot more noticeable and therefore jarring. That's not an excuse, I assure you. If anything, having issues this noticeable with one of the big N64 titles just shows how badly they needed to be fixed before release. This exact issue led to the DK64 example I showed earlier. Input lag from the game adds to input lag from the emulator to make something horrendous. If DK64 was in the Switch library right now, I guarantee you the issue would be just as bad. Worth noting, it actually seems to be less of an input delay and more of a rendering delay, as Danny B's pointed out here.
So the controller vibrates if you bonk, right? I'm gonna put the controller up against the microphone so you can hear how much earlier the vibration happens from when the bonk actually happens on screen. Ready?
I went through the trouble of getting the Japanese version of the software, since that one has Mario 64 Shindo with rumble support, and I can confirm that's the case there too. Something is going on with the rendering of these games, causing these issues to happen. I'd love to pull out actual numbers, but it seems like the people who are able to test latency are only testing Ocarina of Time and using it as a basis for the entire emulator. As far as fog, this one's particularly weird. If we look back here at 3D All-Stars, we'll see that the fog issue doesn't happen at all. implying there is a workaround done for this particular area. Seems like the rendering issue straight up isn't happening here. Oh, and this isn't even mentioning online play. Yeah, it's peer-to-peer, yeah, it's delay-based, no, you can't play with people who are too far away. To be fair, rollback isn't really feasible here in the first place. The SNES is one thing, but there is no way the Nintendo Switch is going to emulate the 64 well enough to seamlessly pull off rollback. I've seen people point at Slippy, the thing that made playing Melee Online really good, as a reason why it should be possible. After all, if a decent gaming PC can implement rollback for GameCube emulation, they should at least be able to do it for N64. Two things about that. One, power isn't everything when it comes to emulation. N64 is still a nightmare to emulate even without trying to implement rollback. Two, Slippy's not actually an example of what we're talking about at all. Slippy's game state is handled by Melee itself, not the emulator. They're a lot like 20XX save states, if you're familiar with those. The emulator just communicates with the game using one of the memory card slots and provides the extra steps needed to make things work smoothly. Slippy works wonderfully, but it does so thanks to sheer ingenuity instead of sheer power. And I'm sorry to say that it's not a level of involvement Nintendo would ever consider for their old games. What's also worth noting is that this emulator has certain quirks that are suspiciously similar to the Wii U's emulator. Very, very similar. It seems very possible that the Wii U emulator was the basis for this, and Nerd just repurposed it for 3D All-Stars. Unfortunately, that also means those issues tend to show up in this version of the game as well. So, yeah. Unfortunately, you can arguably claim that the Switch has shown us the worst in N64 emulation yet. Looking at these issues, I can't help but think back on the original Ocarina of Time emulator for the GameCube. While it provided a great experience on limited hardware, it immediately became unacceptable when it tried to play Majora's Mask. I had always figured that this is because Nintendo, seeing they had an emulator that ran OOT great, tried to shoehorn Majora's Mask in there without giving the team proper resources or time to make it work. If it could even work at all, honestly. I have no proof, but it almost seems like that's what happened here. It would at the very least explain the regression from 3D All-Stars to original Mario 64. Being forced to remove the upgrades and leaving only the base ROM, many of the specific tricks they may have used to make the game appear correct could have been thrown to the wayside. Since there was already a working 64 emulator in the form of 3D All-Stars, it would be very in character for Nintendo to place unreasonable expectations on the developers, expecting them to prepare for an entire collection of games to emulate without the time needed for specific optimizations. Again, please don't treat that as fact. The reason I bring it up is because, if that's the case, they're issues that have a solid chance of being fixed. There are still plenty of games to be released for NSO's N64 library, so there will absolutely be updates to this emulator. Because outside of these issues, I'm of the opinion that the emulator itself is fundamentally pretty solid. It's still unacceptable that it released in the state that it did, especially with how OOT plays, but I think the foundation of this thing is good and just needs some tuning. I've heard a lot of claims that people exaggerate how good the Wii Virtual Console was for N64 games, pointing out its various inaccuracies and saying that we simply look at it fondly because of nostalgia. While I'm sure there's some truth there, I still disagree. I think it's an exceptional piece of software that, if it weren't for the team who tried and succeeded to make OOT play well on the GameCube, we wouldn't have gotten. We would have gotten something that just worked well enough, where it wasn't the ideal version to play, but unless you were to hunt down an N64, it's what you had to put up with. It's a golden standard that, even today, we still use to demonstrate what we want out of N64 emulation, even though we already know the Switch emulator we have isn't capable of meeting it. And it ran Majora's Mask like garbage the first time around because it wasn't ready. But if it is possible for Nerd to fix, people are going to have to convince Nintendo that going the extra mile is worth it. Otherwise, they're going to impose the same unreasonable conditions that led to the poor emulation of these games in the first place. There are already a lot of people saying that what we have now is good, the issues the emulator presents only matters to a small amount of people, and asking for anything more is being unreasonable. If you're one of the people who think that, even after watching this video, that's fine. I just ask that you don't attempt to drown out the voices of people who are having bad experiences with this emulator, because what we have could genuinely be so much better. I guess we'll see what happens though. Until then, thanks for listening, and as always, I hope you keep an eye out for more tech rules.